Welcome back. We were discussing how the British approached dealing with trade obstacles in China, and how opium proved to be a solution to some of these. Now, the Americans, unlike the British, whose interests in China were represented by the monolithic East India Company, didn't take the same approach as the British did.
Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. You found us. Thank you. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Ecclesiastes probably said it best in chapter 1, verse 9, quote, "Everything that has been will be again. Everything that has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun," close quote. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. In this episode, we will cover American trade with China from approximately 1790 to 1860. We will cover in depth American trade with China, including ginseng, fur seal pelts, sandalwood, sea cucumbers, and we will end with a discussion of the Opium Wars, at least the first Opium War in 1839, and a discussion of Chinese diplomatic exceptionalism.
American traders attempted to find other products that they could swap for Chinese goods, but they didn't really have a good appreciation of what the market was like, that they were trying to become a part of. There was not really a good sense of market, and the outsiders were not really permitted to gain this understanding due to restrictions that the Chinese had imposed on Westerners. Americans, and indeed most Europeans, had a poor grasp of the actual state of China. And I'm going to say that this is a phenomenon that is going to continue into the 20th, if not the 21st century. There is a sense that there's this vast untapped market for American and European goods if greater access was permitted. China, in this stage, is still Cathay, a kind of mythical place whose comings and goings were understood to mirror that which was seen depicted on Chinese porcelain or artifacts. Accurate books on the subject of China were in very short supply during this period, and if anything, they tended to confirm these prejudices rather than to contradict them. This is a land of enlightened mandarins, beautiful women, and stunning landscapes. This is China, as far as the West is concerned. But to be fair, this is all they really had to work with in the way of evidence. However, a few people should have been sensitive to the shortcomings of this methodology. Nobody is going to look at pre-revolutionary France and assume everyone's living lives of Rococo splendor. No one would buy into that, or even Britain, engravings by Hogarth. There are limits to what you can glean from artistic artifacts. No one really sought to question how they perceived the Qing dynasty and understood what its power was until the end of the century. For the time being, these were all unknowns here. Regardless of the problems with the methods, there was very little in the limited source materials to give American merchants a good sense of products that could be offered to offset the cost of tea in silver, which, along with everything else, was sort of creating a trade deficit. Throughout the 19th century, when China still had the upper hand as far as trade was concerned, American merchants would attempt to use various commodities to trade with China, often with long-term negative results. And we're going to talk about some of these. So the Americans, some of this is about the dynamic that we're dealing with here. So the East India Company is going to say, okay, the solution is opium. We've got a monopoly on that in India. That's our solution. We don't need to think about this anymore. So it is a large bureaucratic company. America's China trade is being done by individuals. It's not being done by a large body like the East India Company. So therefore, they're going to be a little bit more competitive, a little bit more willing to explore other options, and to avoid the kind of conventional thinking that goes along with it. There was some thought about creating something like an East India Company, but Alexander Hamilton explicitly rejected the idea of placing the China hand in the hands of a monopoly, which would be supported by the government, echoing the free market economy in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. American trade was a lot more dynamic than, say, what the British trade dynamic was. So the U.S.-China trade was open to anyone, and this had other implications as well. The China trade served as an impetus to create a large merchant fleet, which was in need of being recapitalized after the revolution. It had been what had existed before the revolution had kind of been destroyed during the war. But consistent with U.S. and anti-monopolistic approaches, these ships tended to be smaller in tonnage than their British counterparts, leading to more ships going to Canton from America than were coming from the British. But you've also got to take into effect how much they're actually able to carry off and ferry away here. So Napoleonic Wars led to the United States gaining a larger share of the China trade because everybody else is fighting each other during this time period. So we were able to actually seize some of the share of the China trade during this period of time here.
And for those who don't know, the Napoleonic Wars dragged on for about 20 years.
20 years,
so this
yes.
is a long period of time that the Europeans were tied down fighting each other.
And I mean, we had problems during this period as well in terms of trade, because there is this period in 1807 where Jefferson declares an embargo where there is no trade at all. I mean, we think about when this just seems almost like something you'd experience during the pandemic, just this impossible situation that is benefiting nobody. But, you know, it also speaks to Jefferson's interest in a sort of like inwardly focused United States of yeoman farmers, quite at odds with, say, Hamilton's vision of kind of free trade and the United States as being a mercantile power here. A significant portion of what the United States imported for China was actually exported to European ports. So we became the middleman. We were kind of like acting in the role that the British were prior to the Revolution, where they would send their ships and they would take their tea and deliver it to the United States. We're basically bringing tea and other commodities to the United States, and then we're promptly exporting them to Europe. So
the East India Company is defunct at this point.
No, it is not.
It is not. It's still there.
It's still there.
But now we're able to also trade on its turf?
Yes. Because there's a necessity that's at work here. And, of course, we do get into some interesting difficulties with seamen being impressed and other disruptions to maritime trade that's going on. It's not just, you know, an ideal situation, but we're able to steal a march on things. And it's not just Britain that we're delivering goods to. We're delivering goods to other parts of Europe, you know, which is annoying both the British and the French, because we're kind of in violation of Napoleon's continental system by doing this, but we're also kind of circumventing monopolistic practices. There's smuggling going on during this period because huge taxes are needed to fight the war with Napoleon. And so you do have a whole history down in the southern coast of Britain, lots of legends and stories during this period where people are actually smuggling goods in to avoid having to pay the duty and getting, you know, goods at a cheaper cost. And you could have gotten some of those through American traders. The British have given the East India Company, and would continue up until the 1830s, as we'll see.
Yeah, okay.
The monopoly on trade there. So American ginseng is the first thing that we attempt to export to China. And it grows naturally here in the United States. Dominantly at the time, it was harvested in New England and in upstate New York. There was also ginseng in Canada. And this is something that the Chinese couldn't get enough of.
To my understanding, ginseng was originally a Chinese product.
Yes, and it was highly valued within China, but there are, just as there are different varieties of different types of products around the world, there is an American version of ginseng that was discovered first in Canada and then over in New England and upstate New York, occurring naturally. The only problem is, as would be the case with just about everything that we would attempt to trade with China over, once people discovered that this was a profitable commodity, the price suffered because everybody started like exporting this to China. It's kind of like the kids' soccer ball. Ginseng is where the ball is, and so that's what everybody's chasing after. So what happens when prices reach a certain level, they start to decline because the supply is much bigger than demand is. And so prices go down.
So the price crashes. That happens to a lot of agricultural products.
Well, and this is kind of, in a manner of speaking, we are exporting agricultural products of a sort.
Of a sort.
Of a sort.
Ginseng is a root, right? What was it being used for?
Well, primarily it's an aphrodisiac. And there's a lot of things that the Chinese are looking to get from overseas. We're going to get to those damn sea cucumbers, but those are actually thought to be an aphrodisiac as well. And you know, among a certain rarefied type of customer who can afford advanced Chinese herbal medicine, ginseng becomes, you know, this magic cure-all for other things other than sexual dysfunction here. So
the same was true of rhino horn later on, and black bear spleens or something.
Well,
like
those
that.
are still a thing.
They're still a thing.
And I would argue ginseng is still a thing.
It is still a thing.
You know, I mean, people go in and talk about how great ginseng is, and it's nice to have a cup of ginseng tea at night, you know, but I'm not going to say that it's going to turn you into the love machine if you drink enough of it. I think it's a case of mind over matter. But it became a popular commodity. It was sort of like discovering ginseng was almost like discovering gold. It was something that was not widely known beforehand, and it kind of took. In the case of Canada, there was a French botanist that discovered ginseng up there, and then there were other botanists in New England and in upstate New York who discovered American ginseng. This was good enough. It wasn't the same as Chinese ginseng, but it was good enough for the Chinese market there. But once you get something that can be found in abundance, and this is what was good about ginseng, ginseng could kind of keep pace with the demand in terms of we didn't strip mine the ginseng. So there was enough of it to basically allow us to export and also trade here and maintain a steady supply. Not so is the case with fur. And fur is another commodity. You know, you can say this is an agricultural commodity, but it's not something that's actually raised, but it is harvested. This was something that, within the larger context of what's going on in America with the fur trade, this is something that definitely presented opportunities to trade in China. But it had devastating impacts because it's kind of shocking that between 1792 and 1812, 2.5 million sealskins arrived in Canton on U.S. ships. U.S. fur traders kind of worked the islands almost on an industrial basis. They would have people deployed, and they would go and club the seals. And they really had no natural defenses, and there were tactics that they had that were that were intended to allow them to slaughter as many seals as they could come into contact with. The scope of this occurred throughout the northern Pacific, from basically northern California all the way up to Alaska. And these involved trips of about 2 to 3 years where people are going around, picking up pelts, going into Canton.
Sealing, it was called.
Sealing, yes.
You went sealing.
And that is a good word to use because it owed a lot in its approach to whaling. They are related. It's just you don't have, Mad Captain Ahab with his harpoon going after Moby Dick. You have, some crazed homicidal maniac going in and clubbing seals on islands that they're unable to escape from.
And to be zoologically precise, we're talking not really actually about seals, but actually about sea lions, which are a different branch of sealdom.
Well, we're talking kind of
and
about...
they're because they have fur. They're also called fur seals, whereas
yes.
true seals just have blubber, so you're not really going to get any fur off.
But the fur seals are actually what they're after.
Yeah,
and sea lions are a separate commodity to what we're talking about, and they are valued less than fur seals. So you have fur seals, and then you have sea lions. And the reason why fur seals are considered more desirable is just because of the pelts. It is a matter of the state of the pelts, and this found favor with the Chinese, and also found favor elsewhere too. So you kind of have a kind of triangular trade that emerges during this period, because we're also working with the Indians, Native Americans, to be able to carry this out. And again, it kind of follows the same trajectory as, say, like whaling expeditions. So you have triangular trade is we get cheap consumer goods, beads, mirrors, jackknives, things like that gets produced up in New England. Ships load up with these, they take them off, and they trade for pelts with Native Americans.
And can I also interject here too? Also, sea otter pelts, weren't they?
Sea otter pelts
they were
as
sought
well.
after as well, right?
Yes.
The sea otters almost became extinct.
Yes, they and yes, that's kind of what all of this is leading up to.
Right. So those were sought after.
Yes.
So they were sought after. The fur seals were sought after, and then lesser was the sea lions.
Yeah,
So
and
their pelts weren't as
their pelts weren't as luxurious. They're and it's kind of like it depends on who the market is for this.
Okay. All right.
Now, again, we're not talking every peasant home in China is buying this fur. This fur is limited to a very rarefied, wealthy audience of people. So your customer base is somewhat lesser than what you would think. But you would have, again, the kind of...
Lesser in terms of numbers.
In terms of numbers.
High status.
High status.
Wealthy people.
Wealthy people.
Yes.
But not, you're not going to have like the folks that you would see in Pearl Buck's The Good Earth going down to the market to go buy some fur seals or some sea lion pelts. This is a product for the wealthy here. But you basically sell your furs in Canton, and then you get the Chinese products that end up in places like Boston, Salem, and New York. So this is a fairly successful enterprise, but what happens, like you said, is that we end up with declining supply and declining prices. The initial prices are marvelous, but then once you start glutting the market with oversupply, the price of pelts collapses. But at the same time, you've kind of killed off whole colonies of marine mammals here in order to kind of offset this difficulty.
It wasn't until maybe the early 20th century or maybe the late 19th century that the United States actually started taking action to protect the fur seals, sea lions, and sea otters up there.
Or any animal.
Or any animal, really, yeah. But, they've gradually recovered.
Yes.
But you had armed ships going out and trying to protect them and things, too, to prevent poaching and stuff like that, and follow the herds as they migrated and everything. It became quite a thing. But that was off in the future. That was in the
in the 20th century.
Early 20th century.
Yeah.
Before that happened. And there had been a lot of destruction by that time.
Yes. You know, I mean, at one point you had huge populations of these marine mammals that were available throughout, you know, the northern Pacific region on small islands, you know, just sitting there minding their own business, and then all of a sudden people come by with clubs and...
Well, the reason they haul up on those islands to have their young is because there's not supposed to be anybody preying on them.
Yes.
It's supposed to be safe, and then suddenly people with clubs show up, and they weren't adapted for that.
Yes.
And don't have a defense strategy.
And
they in 20 years, you can do a lot of damage to a population and kill it off even.
And they
that's what
did.
We kept doing.
That's what we kept doing.
Very repeated cycle.
Yeah.
Same
Yes.
with whaling.
Yeah.
Same with beaver pelts earlier on.
Yes, yes. But let's move on from fur, because there's another commodity that eventually the Americans discover is desirable in China, and this is sandalwood. Sandalwood trees are native to the Pacific Islands, stretching all the way from Malaysia and India, with also Hawaiian and Fijian sandalwood being available as well. The Hawaiian and Fijian sandalwood is not of the same quality as Indian or Malaysian varieties, but still very attractive. And by 1812, the fur traders were starting to call on Hawaii to pick up shipments of sandalwood along with the pelt shipments that they were sending off to Canton there. So eventually this is going to become a growing concern, which will lead to the destruction of sandalwood forest in both Fiji and Hawaii.
So this is not a botany podcast, but our listeners are polymaths and they can handle a little bit of botany. So it's about to become a botany podcast briefly. But for those who don't know about sandalwoods, let's discuss what they were and why they were so important. True sandalwoods, there's some other species that are not true sandalwoods that are called sandalwood, but we're not talking about those. True sandalwoods are of the genus Santalum, and they're actually relatives of European mistletoe. There's 7 species of them, and as you said, they were insular Southeast Asia, Melanesia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands was where they originated from. But they were brought to the mainland of Asia in ancient times by traders. And in fact, in South India, they had been naturalized there by about 1300 BC. So they've been there for a long time on the mainland. And they grow, since that time, they've grown in India, Southeast Asia, southeastern China, and Taiwan, as well as in their original range. And why is sandalwood so valuable? It's very good for wood carving. You can make furniture out of it and things like that. But it's also prized in traditional medicine, and above all, as incense, because it has a woody, floral kind of a scent to it. And the wood can remain fragrant for decades after you harvest it. So you get a long-standing hit off the smell of this stuff. But it's important as incense in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Jainism, in Taoism, Korean shamanism, Sufism, and Zoroastrianism. And sandalwood oil can be extracted from the sandalwood. And even today, that's very sought after, and it's very expensive. It costs several $1,000s to buy a kilogram or a liter of sandalwood oil, even in today's money. So it remains a very expensive thing. It had an interesting impact on Hawaii. In Hawaii, it's called iliahi. Hawaiians knew about it. Didn't really exploit it the way it was going to be exploited in the future, but they were aware of it. They were aware it had these aromatic properties. Westerners first became of the aromatic properties of Hawaiian sandalwood when they burned some as firewood in 1790 and said, gee, that smells good. It smells like sandalwood. Oh, what do you know? We have sandalwood here too. And so starting in 1791, they tried to export it to China because China was a huge market for sandalwood. But the Chinese viewed it as inferior to the sandalwood of Fiji and the Solomon Islands, where they were getting their supply from at the time. And so the merchants found no buyers in China. But eventually, as you were saying, the sandalwoods in Fiji and the Solomon Islands ran out. And then suddenly the sandalwood market in Hawaii became much more attractive to the Chinese. So American merchants found that they could sell sandalwood in China for 4 times as much as they paid for it in Hawaii. So it's very lucrative for them. And for the Hawaiian royalty and chiefs, they had started developing a taste for Western goods and Western comforts, and they found that they could earn a lot of money that Westerners would or I shouldn't say money, actually. It wasn't really a money economy. They found that they could barter, I guess is a better way to put it, sandalwood in exchange for all of these niceties of life that they wanted to get from the Western world.
There was one of the authors that I consulted when preparing this who referred to the Hawaiian royalty as using it as sort of like a bank account.
They did. And in fact, they essentially took loans out against it because in order to fund themselves, they would basically, in modern Western capitalist terms, they would sell sandalwood futures.
Yes.
Right? If you give me this nice thing I want, you get some of next year's sandalwood, right? And because the Hawaiians never really had a capitalistic or money economy until Westerners showed up, and Westerners had just shown up recently in Hawaii, they didn't really understand capitalism that well, but they did grasp the idea of sandalwood futures pretty well. And so King Kamehameha I, who had united the islands, even placed a kapu, which is Hawaiian for like taboo, on harvesting sandalwood for anything other than his own personal stockpile that he could use for his purchases. And eventually he started to see that if you killed all the saplings and harvested them too, you wouldn't have any sandalwood someday. So he actually put a ban on harvesting the saplings. So it's kind of an early recognition of the need for sustainable agriculture, right, for these things. So when the Fijian and Solomon Island markets crashed, and you were saying around 1812, sandalwood started getting harvested intensively in Hawaii. And that lasted from about 1815 to about 1825 or 1826 was the most intensive. It may have peaked around 1823, but it doesn't matter. And then it started to decline in Hawaii just because they were starting to run out of trees. And it finally came to an end completely around 1840 when the supply of trees was exhausted.
Well, what happened, as I understand it, is that his successor, King Kamehameha I, his successor did not take such an enlightened view towards sandalwood and became even more aggressive about exploiting what was there and with really no thought for the future there.
That is correct. You're stealing my thunder. In fact, he urged the chiefs to pay him, whatever you call it, tribute or something by getting more sandalwood. And the chiefs then turned around and told their underlings that worked for them, burn the forests. And when you smell sandalwood, put the fire out and go harvest whatever's left of the sandalwood, right? Because it's valuable. Imagine how destructive that was in Hawaiian forests. But that actually happened So it was a terribly destructive thing. There are 4 endemic sandalwood species in Hawaii, and they all did survive. But the population has never recovered in terms of number of trees or the size of the trees. You used to have very substantial trees. There aren't that many big ones anymore just because they're very slow growing. It takes a long time to redevelop a sandalwood tree. So they weren't completely wiped out, but they were so few and they were so unexploitable that finally the market collapsed around 1840. And in fact, it's interesting that, as you're mentioning, talking about sandalwood futures there, it wound up being a huge issue in Hawaii. We're talking about the environmental destructiveness of it, but also it was economically destructive because the royalty and the chiefs were pressing the average Hawaiian more and more to go gather sandalwood for them, sometimes at the expense of things like food.
Yes.
So it had a terrible impact on the peasants, if that's the right word, the Kanakas they were called in Hawaii. A terrible impact on them, this market. Little side note, little interesting story too about it. There was a fellow named Boki. That was like his nickname, but he used it as his ruling name. Boki. He was a high chief, and he served as the royal governor of Oahu, which is the island where Honolulu is. He was in a lot of debt because of sandalwood futures. So he got 2 ships together and set off in 1829 with his crews to go find sandalwood forests, what he had heard were in abundance in the New Hebrides, which are now called Vanuatu. That's a 3,500-mile voyage to get there. He never came back, and he probably never got to the New Hebrides, and he was said to have been lost at sea. But I think it was in the late 19th century, some people went to Samoa, and they found out that Boki had been shipwrecked in Samoa and survived, and apparently decided to settle down in Samoa. He had descendants there, apparently deciding that it was better to just stay in Samoa and start a new life than go back to Hawaii and face all those sandalwood debts that he had no way of paying off in the future. So that was Boki. So he's one example of the impact that sandalwood had in terms of both environmental but also economic and social destruction that it caused in Hawaii.
I mean, I have seen, discussions about trade in the period that we're talking about here, 18th and 19th century, where there will be pictures, genre pictures, genre paintings of women sitting around having tea at a table, not unlike the table we're sitting at right now to do the podcast. And it's like, where does all this stuff come from, and what cost is being borne throughout the world in order to make this possible? A kind of mundane situation. So we're seeing economic problems occur in places that people who are drinking the tea or using the silk or eating off the porcelain have no clue about this whole thing about seals being wiped out or forests being decimated just to bring them that cup of tea that they've got. And it gets even worse if you start factoring in sugar and slavery in the West Indies. There's a lot of hidden things happening that are not necessarily understood by the average consumer as the world is becoming increasingly imperialistic.
I mean, I don't think there was any sense in humanity at that time of any kind of limitations on what nature could produce.
Yes.
Nature was big.
Nature's big.
The world was big. There was plenty of everything out there, and it would just keep coming back. It didn't matter how much of it you took.
just needed to find it.
You just go find it and harvest it.
Yeah.
We know now that doesn't make any sense, but it hadn't really occurred to people back then. Very well.
So there is another commodity which we promised to talk about, and this is bêche de mer, or sea cucumbers.
So we're going from botany to zoology now, right? To marine biology?
Yes, we are.
Excellent,
yes. So the sea cucumbers are imported by the U.S., and they were meant to serve the Chinese consumer. Sea cucumbers are used to flavor food. It's kind of interesting. We're thinking about spices and flavoring ingredients coming from the East. Well, here's something that's going to the East. I don't think that anybody regularly uses sea cucumbers as a flavoring ingredient. They were also used, like ginseng, to increase sexual prowess. And that has something to do with sort of like things that are longer than they are wide, which sea cucumbers are.
Most cultures in East and Southeast Asia regard sea cucumbers as a delicacy.
Yeah.
Make several dishes with sea cucumber in those parts of the world. So there you go.
It was acquired from the natives in Hawaii, like the sandalwood, and very profitable in the 1820s and 1830s. One Salem captain sold a shipment costing $3,500, and it went for $27,000 in Canton. So that's a pretty good profit margin there on a commodity here. It brought frequent clashes with the natives because there was really no sense of humanity about acquiring this, and there was a kind of industrial type production in terms of harvesting and preparing these for shipment to China. But it was a very labor-intensive process, requiring labor to work under really poor conditions here. So these products have all helped, but they do not solve the problem of how to pay for Chinese goods. And this gets back to the lack of a universally recognized system of credit, and ultimately creates even greater difficulties for all that are involved here. Western traders would have to engage in illegal activity to provide them with the silver they needed to purchase Chinese goods, and this is to the opium trade. And this would lead to practices that were destabilizing to the Chinese state. The practices that China is adopting during this period are meant to kind of safeguard its position as the Middle Kingdom. It's actually eroding it. Nobody realizes this until after it's happened. And ultimately, this isn't good for either side, as we shall see. So, a critical part of understanding what's going on with the Americans in China involves us taking a look at the British. So we're going to kind of go off on a tangent at this portion to look at the first Opium War and the factors associated with the opium trade. Again, we are not necessarily big players in this because it's kind of cumbersome. Opium is not as easy to be had by U.S. traders as it is for the British East India Company. But we are part of this, and there are factors associated with the opium trade that impact the U.S. as well. And the outcome of the first Opium War is going to impact U.S. relations with China as well. In 1799, this is when the Chinese Empire made opium illegal, and no one in the West really cared. British and U.S. Merchants were involved in the opium trade proved more than capable of circumventing laws and preventing the import or sale. Now, part of this is geography, because in order to get to Canton, you have to sail up the Pearl River. And along the sides of the Pearl River, there are places where shipments can be unloaded of opium, exchanged for silver. And it's very difficult for China to be able to detect these. And even if you find them, there are other places you can go to. You can change the pattern of events. I mean, it's kind of like trying to master the drug trade now in the United States along the southern border, where, presumably we have far more advanced and capable means to be able to look at the drug trade there. China didn't necessarily have the same resources. It had some resources. It did have kind of a navy. These were junks for the most part. These were not double-masted ships, but they were single-masted. So they could use those to get around. Kind of what they're looking at is sort of like a brown water force that could go in and do patrols to sort of safeguard the borders here. However, since China is inwardly focused and not benefiting from competition, trying to avoid competition from other countries, their weapons are not going to be as capable as we will see in countering what's going to happen as far as the West goes. So problems start to develop, kind of as we were talking previously, about how things are starting to change around the 1820s and the 1830s. And along with the other products that we were looking at previously, we're also seeing opium spreading at the same time, and the Chinese becoming intent on halting the opium trade because they're facing all sorts of difficulties as a result of this. And this doesn't really make a difference to the British or the Americans. Again, they can avoid Chinese restrictions. The British had absolutely no consideration whatsoever about the impact of opium, as much as, say, we would have of clubbing a colony of seals. That's the kind of level that was involved here. The Americans, to their credit, and this is among kind of the evangelical Protestant community that would find opium a bad idea, up there with, say, alcohol consumption. Probably, it's considered part and parcel of that. And they kind of, just as they rejected that, they rejected opium use. And there were actually one or two companies that traded in China that explicitly said, we are not doing this at all because of the impact that it could have on people. But the British are the ones who are leaders in this, and what they're telling the Chinese that they ought to do is they ought to just legalize it and tax it, which is something the Chinese could have done, but they opted not to because it was becoming too much of a problem for them to benefit from it. Now, Mike, you had mentioned when does the East India Company lose its monopoly? That happens also in the 1830s, in 1833. And there had been a lot of pressure from other merchant companies within Britain on Parliament to kind of get rid of this corrupt, monopolistic East India trading organization. The ideas, again, of Adam Smith are coming down from Edinburgh and Wealth of Nations and free trade And these were the battle cries that kind of like undermined it. It didn't eliminate the East India Company, because that's going to exist until the 1870s as an entity. It's going to create considerable problems over in India, but we don't need to get into that. But it's still going to be around, but there's going to be other traders that are going to be involved in China. Now, what this does, though, this may say, hurrah for free trade, but it's bad news because of the implications. So the Foreign Office is going to support someone with plenipotentiary powers in China who is going to be a government official who will have access to the government for redress if something goes wrong here. That is the thing that comes out of this demonopolization of the China trade. And that is what is going to have huge, huge implications for how Britain and China and ultimately the United States interact with each other. The Qing dynasty is trying to combat opium when it's also having its own difficulties. They're losing the mandate of heaven, and a process which will continue until the early part of the 20th century. But everybody at this point in the 1830s, there's a huge mass of people that are like buying into opium smoking culture. So it was a tradition among, say, the upper-class gilded youth. But it also had spread, because as you're getting more opium in there, it's becoming more and more affordable, so that all social classes are indulging. This is including government officials, the gentry, craftsmen, merchants, entertainers, women of all social classes, according to one source. So, from courtesans in Beijing, in the Forbidden City, all the way down to common prostitutes are using opium. It's also impacting the clergy, Buddhist monks and nuns, and Taoist priests. So, while we can say that opium consumption is not a direct cause of the fall of the Qing dynasty, it's a characteristic that contributed to a loss of status, and it destabilized the empire at the same time, both through direct and, as we'll see, indirect means here. What we're also seeing is that while this addiction is spreading, there is also, we're seeing a kind of turnaround among intellectuals, and in terms of a lack of admiration, the kind of quotation that we had from Franklin becomes more an exception than the rule. There's a certain amount of contempt that's involved. There's contempt for Chinese legal niceties, and less of an admiration for China itself. Now, admittedly, they're only seeing a tiny sliver of what is China, one port city and various other areas such as Macau along the southern coast. They're not seeing the full country, but this is enough to kind of undermine confidence in the opinion of it.
The Portuguese are in Macau by now.
Yes, but Macau is also a huge trading area for people who are involved here. There's a whole process that involves using Macau to sort of advance your way into Canton. We don't need to get into that because it's kind of a detailed one, but it was definitely part and parcel of how you would actually commence your operations in China. It was heavily regulated, and there are various documents you need to get and so forth, but we don't need to go there.
But they've been there for a long time, is my point. They've been there since, what, the 1500s or something? In Macau. Yeah. So that was one Western outpost or incursion, whatever, longstanding.
Yes.
But that was about it, other than Canton.
Yeah. We do have the emergence here at the late 1830s of an official, an incorruptible official, who would be consistent with Franklin's estimation of what all mandarins were like, and we will see what happens to him. So this is Lin Zibao, who is moral almost to a fault, and certainly moral to his own personal destruction. He is determined to eliminate the opium trade in Canton, and he is appointed by the emperor to deal with this area, to be in charge of this area. So he starts off using soft power. He sends a note to no less than Queen Victoria saying, hey, this is illegal. Y'all are violating our laws by bringing this opium into our country. It is having a negative impact on the people. Please, 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 Your Majesty, use your influence to stop it. It is doubtful whether Queen Victoria even saw this note. But that was the first step. It would not be the last one, because since he didn't have the ability to do that, in January of 1839, he used kind of Chinese junks and other components of their coastal defense force to prevent the import of opium at that time. 2 months later, he confiscates 3.9 million pounds of opium, mainly from the British, but not only from the British. So just think about this. There is 3.9 million tons of opium lying around that's coming in this one instance of time here. So that should give you a sense of volume here, at least volume that we would know about. In order to do this, he kind of like merchants who were in Canton, he kind of held them under house arrest and prevented them from joining their ships. He was compelling them to basically surrender their supplies of opium. Now,
these are foreign merchants.
These are foreign
China.
merchants,
Okay.
namely British merchants.
British merchants, okay.
That are involved in this. Now, what we have, like I said, was we had a British trade representative who is affiliated with the British Foreign Office, and this is Royal Navy Captain Charles Elliot, who is kind of overseeing the British interest as far as foreign trade in Canton. He is a government official. He is not an official of the East India Company. What he's doing is he's saying, give up your supplies of opium. We will get you compensation in due course. And and where they're going to get it is going to kind of determine what happens as far as China goes here. In June, the opium is publicly destroyed, and there is a blockade of the Pearl River. And the British are really suffering from Lin's methods here. They are trying to prevent foreign ships from entering the Pearl River, and this is, of course, the only route that you can get to Canton, and it's the only place that you can trade there. And this is, again, all legal under Chinese law. And under international law, we would recognize a country's ability to kind of combat illegal activity as being a right that they enjoyed.
Well, I suspect that we would limit that to European countries and the United States. And
well, I don't know.
I'm not sure. Did it really apply to everybody in terms of everyone's mind at that time? Right?
No, it wouldn't have applied.
Given the tenor of the times, I can't imagine.
It wouldn't have applied to. But nowadays, under international law now, this would be considered perfectly a legitimate practice. I mean, we do stuff like this with drugs that have been confiscated.
I'm just trying to make the point that back in those days, there's understandings between European countries and the United States while these things are done, but they're not going to apply those to non-European countries.
And the thing is, opium is still legal.
Yeah,
it is a legal commodity. You know, it'd be like, say like we're trying to bring in bourbon or something to some country that, a Muslim country or something. That would be kind of like how things were done. So as the opium is being destroyed, Elliot is requesting assistance from the Royal Navy, which was the most significant, powerful maritime organization in the world. And he was seeking action from the Royal Navy to resolve this situation with the Chinese and how This is impacting trade, you know. So while the British at the time are not going to use defense of the drug trade, even though it's illegal, it still has sort of negative connotations among certain elements of the population. They did zero in on this treatment of British citizens in the port of Canton as something that they needed to kind of like nip in the bud here. And the foreign minister at the time was none other than Lord Palmerston, and Lord Palmerston was a great believer in the rights of Englishmen throughout the world, and it would be Englishmen is what he would refer to it, not the rights of Britons back then. So as it turns out...
And not necessarily the rights of any other people.
Not necessarily, because the other rights of people, it's up to them to deal with.
Yes.
That is their responsibility. You go defend your own rights. I, as Palmerston, am going to defend the rights of Englishmen. So this was not, by no means a certain policy, sending the Royal Navy to go and defend the rights of Englishmen. The Tories, who were the opposition party, were kind of like taking a very like anti-drug position and saying, well, you know, this is the laws of China, you know, we need to respect them. Palmerston managed, though, to carry a motion in Parliament by 9 votes, which is good enough. And so essentially what we have is a force that's led by Captain Elliott's cousin, Admiral Elliott. So we have 2 Elliots running around here that are involved in this. So we've got 16 warships with 540 guns, 4 armed steamers, 27 transports, and 4,000 crack troops. 4,000 troops with the British military at the time is a significant number, a significant portion of it, just given how small the standing army is. And they're all deploying from India, which is kind of a new and different kind of change because you have a base that you can forward deploy assets for that can get to China a lot faster than sending them all the way from the UK there. They were, as to who is going to be paying for this rather expensive means of delivering a response, a note from the foreign minister, well, that's going to be China. And that's who the British basically were going to hit them with an indemnity, and that becomes part and parcel of what the First Opium War is all about. The British forces, so just keep in mind at the timeline, a year after all the opium's been destroyed, that's when the British actually arrived there, and that's how long it takes them to put things together here. So this is kind of interesting in terms of how long it would take for some of this process. So some ships blockade Canton, and other ships are basically proceeding along China's coast to blockade other ports, which are being used kind of for internal distribution of goods and products here. And so ports and rivers are being blockaded, heading north towards the capital, which is something that the Chinese have an issue with being attacked there. So the emperor is rather alarmed at this naval force that has shown up in response to his officials' ability to kind of like try to halt the drug trade. So he sends somebody to kind of negotiate with the British. Lin is very strongly rebuked, even though he's just following orders and policy. The fact that the British have reacted in such a hostile manner has kind of like put him in the doghouse there. So China's coastal defense force is totally outmatched by the British naval forces, who were the best in the world and had the most sophisticated guns of the 2 countries. So what the British wanted, they wanted Hong Kong. This is where Hong Kong kind of enters the British Empire. They wanted an indemnity of, to begin with, $6 million, and to increase direct official contacts, meaning you're not going to be able to fob off the British representatives as being sort of second rate, and they would be treated as equals by the Chinese, which was sort of unheard of in imperial circles here. The official that actually negotiated these terms, this is the first agreement to kind of defuse the Opium War, was a gentleman by the name of Quishan. However, when the emperor learned that he had agreed to all of these terms, he was threatened with execution, but later reduced to banishment from the court. He did not end with a successful career here. However, this kind of spells the end of Chinese diplomatic exceptionalism, which they had promoted throughout the history of the China trade with foreigners. Because the British are not going to take no for an answer, even though the emperor has failing to ratify this organization. We get a new envoy showing up, a Sir Henry Pottinger, who replaces Captain Elliot. And he has more ships and more troops. And he's basically taking control of Chinese gun batteries along the Pearl River, seizing part of Canton. He's definitely showing the influence of sea power on the history of the world here by moving things along here. So he and his forces agree to leave for $6 million. Again, that was the figure that was originally discussed and deemed unacceptable.
And I looked it up, by the way, and in today's money,
yeah,
that's $223 million.
In
case you wondered.
In case we wondered,
yeah.
Okay. So once paid, Pottinger begins seizing multiple ports along the coast of China. And again, the Chinese, if we're talking, we have talked about how we were ignorant of China. China is really ignorant of the West.
I was about to make that point. Yeah.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, because they'd been insular, they really didn't know that much about the world around them. And so when the British showed up with the capabilities they had, that was a surprise.
Yes.
Right? I didn't know they could do that. Well, now you do, and you found out the hard way, right?
Yeah.
So it's mutual ignorance.
Yes.
Really. I mean, on both sides,
And self-sustaining mutual ignorance.
Right.
Because, they're...
And arrogance.
And arrogance.
If you think they're better than everybody else and have nothing to learn from them, and you don't really know them much well, you just show up and attack them and you'll win, or defend yourself and you'll win, then you don't really, right, have much curiosity about the other side either.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of what some people view that as a failing. I would view it as, a failing to know something and to be curious about other parts of the world here.
I've never understood how you're worse off knowing about other parts of the world.
But I don't
know why that would be the case, but there are people who seem to think that. Right?
There are people who seem to think that. There are very much people who seem to think that. And so this is meant to be a cautionary tale to them. So eventually peace does break out, and this is in August 1842. And this is not so much as negotiated as dictated to China by the British, following all of the actions by the Royal Navy. So instead of $6 million, they're forced to pay $21 million indemnity on top of the $6 million indemnity that they had already paid to cover the cost of the opium. So they destroyed the opium, but they had to pay for it. And so the cost of the war and various debts owed by Chinese merchants to their British counterparts were also meant to be covered by that $21 million figure. Monopoly of trade at Canton was ended, and now merchants could trade at not just at Canton, but at Fushu, Xiamen, Niambro, and Shanghai, which is then only a mid-sized commercial pub and not the major city it would later become. And the British also gained Hong Kong from this. And subsequent negotiations, and these were really rather cannily conducted, where no one wanted to say opium trade, but it was kind of alluded to. And it was kind of understood that this was not going to be interfered with in the future.
Do you know what the British called it then? We call it the Opium War now, but they didn't call it that then.
No, what did they call it?
I don't know. I'm asking. Do you have any idea? Let's see if we figure that out.
I mean, yeah.
What their cover name for it was, because I've only ever heard it called the Opium War, or the Opium Wars. There was more than one.
Yeah, there's a second one.
Yeah, the Second Opium War, but I wonder what they called it back then. Anyway, I'll look and you push on.
We're not going to necessarily get into the Second Opium War because the first one is the one that really has the
really
impact
matters,
on U.S. policy here.
Right.
So
The Anglo-Chinese War.
That's very nice.
Which is fine. Pretty much describes that, I suppose.
Very nice.
It
Yes.
does. It's very nice. Let's talk about what all of this means to the British. I mean to the Americans. What these actions by the British meant for the Americans, who were also involved in the China trade, but not involved with opium as such. So one person who took, the Americans were kind of thought this was outrageous regarding opium. They kind of felt like they're drug dealers. They're kind of forcing their product on an unwilling China. And so there was a lot of anger. And of course, we didn't like the British back then. British were still our rivals. We had fought 2 wars, the American Revolution. We had fought the War of 1812. We were very anti-British and would be until the 20th century. So the fact that the British are doing this just seemed awful. The one exception to this, who took a typically contrarian view, was John Quincy Adams, who opposed Chinese diplomatic exceptionalism, and he basically argued the Chinese brought all of this on themselves. And this was a position that was so unpopular that the article that he made this claim in was rejected by the original publisher, and it could not be published anywhere.
Flesh out Chinese diplomatic exceptionalism for us a little more.
Well, it's basically...
What does that term capture then? I know it's the Chinese attitude toward themselves, right?
Well, it's basically you as a Western foreigner are inferior.
Okay.
And you are to basically follow the dictates of China if you wish to have dealings with them. There is no give and take. There is no equality. If you want to visualize this, imagine you have to kowtow to the emperor when you're going in there.
The kowtowing.
You're not just doing a polite bow like what would be accepted in European circles. So
you've come to the Middle Kingdom. We're at the center of things.
And you follow.
You're on the periphery.
Yes.
So you will follow our.
And so what Adams is kind of like saying is that, okay, China, if you're going to deal with us, you need to act like one of us. You need to act like a Western power. You need to have kind of mutually respectful attitudes towards us, and we will respect you. But if you don't, then we're going to, you've brought all of this on yourselves by trying to act in ways that are contrarian to Western powers.
Which would be a wrenching change for China after all those
it would be
thousands of years of being a central part of the world, of their world.
Of their world. And it was. It became that. But I'll just stress, this was not a popular position that Adams is advancing here. And I was tempted to bring some quotations in there, but they're kind of no more appealing now than they were then. And so...
from what you're describing, Adams is taking the position that the arrogant power is China, and it kind of has it kind of has it coming to get someone beat up on it and show it its real place.
Yes.
The more popular attitude is more like, well, the British are an arrogant power, and they're trying to deal drugs to these poor Chinese people and beating them up so they can do it.
Yeah.
And okay. And there's probably some truth to both positions.
Well,
I suppose,
Adams,
but it's hard to take the side of the drug dealers.
Yes.
When I say that. But
Adams is kind of like a product of the European diplomatic establishment when he's making these statements. He has certain expectations for how powers conduct relations between each other. That's kind of this kind of classical Napoleonic era period in diplomacy. He's thinking about, say, like the Congress of Vienna would be kind of how these dynamics occurred here. just going in and saying, no, you can't do this because I am China is not sufficient for him, because powers that would act like that, it would be kind of like maybe Napoleon or somebody like that who would try to insist by fiat that what they said is the way to do it. And given the fact that Napoleon has just been defeated a few decades previously, this is not the exemplar in international relations. But it's still it's not something that's going to do him much credit. So American merchants, as I've said, did not have the same benefit from that because they just didn't have the same access to supplies. But Americans did take more than a passing interest in the first Opium War, even if they weren't necessarily involved in the opium trade. So they were kind of opposed to British supporting the opium trade, but they weren't opposed to greater access to China for themselves. This kind of position that they found themselves on, I would argue, is not possible without the humiliations that are inflicted upon China under the Treaty of Nanjing, which concluded the First Opium War. Because once, it's kind of like with Perry in Japan. When we open up Japan, all these other foreign countries start coming in and say, we want access to Japan. So in this case, it's not us, it's the British that's kind of doing this as far as Japan goes.
There's a lot of parallels between the Chinese situation and the Japanese situation.
Yes.
The outcomes are amazingly different, though, in that China had its period of humiliation here, right?
Yeah.
Japan kind of looked at the West coming in and said, these people have bigger and better guns and ships and everything that we do, and we'd better be more like them if we want to survive in this world. And Japan kind of wound up being the first non-European, non-American great power in a Western sense of what great power went, because they went down a different path.
Yes.
I mean, I think the Japanese story is a very interesting one. I'm digressing for a second, but just because their experience of, what are the right words, modernization, Westernization, at least opening to the West, is so vastly different from so many other countries around the world.
Well,
China and what we're talking about here, but so many others were so badly disrupted by it, the Japanese kind of adopted what they liked and adapted it to their needs and kept on going.
If you look at attitudes towards China and towards Japan in the 19th century, there is still a healthy respect for Japan that you do not find with China that continues to grow. With Japan's coming out party is really the Russo-Japanese War, but there's also the Sino-Japanese War as well, where they go in and slice off bits of China. Japan becomes kind of like considered a great power. Britain actually, instead of colonizing Japan and insisting on treaty rights, they create a sort of system of alliance, a formal alliance with Japan that exists. We go in and actually negotiate with the Russians and the Japanese. Theodore Roosevelt wins the Nobel Prize.
Treaty of Portsmouth.
For the Treaty of Portsmouth. So
I didn't mean to get us all down a whole rabbit hole on Japan, but I'm just saying that, it is kind of interesting how different it was and what was to come for China, their period of humiliation.
Well,
you're right. I mean, you had to have the Treaty of Nanjing in order to open China up. So, yeah, if you wanted to have greater trade with China, that was a necessary step for that to happen. But in the case of China, it also wound up having a lot of very negative repercussions that, in the case of Japan, it didn't have.
And I think it has something to do with the internal dynamics of both.
Yeah.
Whereas the Japanese, even though they had been just as isolated, they had Nagasaki as a treaty port that kind of functions in the same way that Canton. They are not being walked all over by the West.
Right.
They are, if anything, respect is increasing. And then when we get to something like the Boxer Rebellion, which we'll address in future episodes, we're working with Japan on this. Japan was
one of the great powers that went into Peking and everything. Sure. And earned great respect from the Europeans and the Americans for their discipline, their professionalism. The Japanese army did in that thing. So yeah, they were But see, that's what's going to happen from where we are in talking here on the pod over the next 60, 70 years. Japan's going to wind up in that position. China is not.
No, it's not.
Yeah, and it starts.
It kind of starts with the Treaty of Nanjing is when things are happening. But then there is also what we see happening is, so we've got President Tyler sending a kind of blue ribbon commission to draft a treaty with the Chinese, assuming correctly the Chinese would be unwilling to risk a further clash with a Western nation. Now, we did not have the capability to do what the British did, but did China know this? No. They had, it's like there's kind of a lot of similarity to them. We don't want to have them show up with all these boats and Marines and troops and everything. We wouldn't have done anything. I can't imagine us doing anything like that in any event. Like the most we're going to get is like Perry, and Perry's like, "Hi, we're here to deliver this note here," and
at that time. Later in the 19th century, we did start to do things like that in East Asia. Like there's we did some fighting in Korea.
Yeah,
the U.S. Navy presence out there was called the East India Squadron before the American Civil War, and the Asiatic Squadron after the American Civil War. And it's been forgotten now, but in 1871, 2 of its ships exchanged fire with forts in the Han River estuary on the west coast of Korea. So 9 days later, we attacked and captured the forts, and a lot of Korean deaths were involved. That was called the Battle of Ganghwa, Ganghwa, if anyone wants to look it up and learn more about it, in June 1871. But that was off in the future from the standpoint of where we are in your narrative, Marshall, and that you're laying out for us here. I just want to make sure the listeners realize that we were involved in some fighting in East Asia in the 19th century.
Yes, that was a different world, though. I'm talking about in the pre-Civil War period. There's just we're not going to be projecting power around the world here. Right. We might send some ships to take on the Barbary pirates, but that's going to be it as far as what our capabilities are.
Just a note, though, before the Civil War, we did have squadrons stationed around the world. They weren't large, but we did. There was I mentioned the East India Squadron. There was a squadron in the Mediterranean. We did have a presence
to guard trade,
and things. But you're not talking a large number of ships.
No, I'm not talking something that would be capable
or something,
of,
maybe, and
like First Opium War.
So we were there, but you're right. We're not going to take on China with that force.
No. So, kind of what we're insisting upon, and this is the Treaty of Wangzhou, and Caleb Cushing, who is one of the leading diplomatic statesmen, was involved with the commission, as was a relative of Daniel Webster. So, fairly influential group that's sent over to negotiate this treaty, and it contains many of the elements of the Treaty of Nanjing. There's free and equal relations between U.S. and Chinese counterparts, so no more of this diplomatic exceptionalism. We're not looking to gain something like Hong Kong, but I would argue that what we got has larger implications for both China and America than it would be if we gained an outpost like Hong Kong. So what we got was we were able to avoid being tried in Chinese courts, which is kind of nice. Extraterritoriality is what that's called. So it's no longer a crime to learn Chinese, which it had been. So people are going to be able to communicate directly with Chinese people. But Americans got the right to build houses, churches, hospitals, and cemeteries in China, their own. And particularly houses and churches are what's going to have the big impact. Hospitals, too, because it's going to give the Chinese access to Western medical care. But churches, we're not going to be seeing Confucian temples is not what the Americans are going to be building. They're going to be building Christian churches. And Canton is no longer going to be the only playground for American missionaries to go to because there's greater access to the areas around these various treaty ports, which we're gaining access to, the same treaty ports that the British have opened up. And we're still doing, and even some people are still doing the opium trade. So one person who was a big proponent of the opium trade was Warren Delano Jr. Warren Delano Jr. got crushed economically in 1857. He took his daughter Sarah off to Hong Kong. He plied the opium trade for about 3 years and rebuilt his fortune. Sarah was the mother of FDR. And FDR, if you've ever been to his house, there's all sorts of elements of the China trade there. And FDR mistakenly believed himself to be an expert on China. This is a topic for another show, but that's where the origins come from. But Warren Delano actually wrote a defense of the opium trade, saying that it was beneficial, needful, and useful, almost like the way some people are describing slavery these days. The fact that we're going to see the growth of a missionary culture, and that's what this actually leads us to. And we're going to also be able to have a more complete knowledge of China. At this point, familiarity is breeding contempt, because no more do we have this sort of idealized nation of Cathay. We have understanding of the lot of the Chinese peasant and just how miserable life can be for people over in China. So instead of being this rather fantastic world with a kind of higher level culture, we're actually seeing people come to an appreciation that not everything is looking like depictions of court life on Chinese screens or Chinese artwork there. It's something harsher and more difficult. And this is going to be driving people to go out and try to help people to stop screwing up their lives with this traditional stuff that's not been doing things that are beneficial to them. It's actually going to be, people are going to be trying to save China. And one of the elements of saving China is Christianity. Another thing that's going to help with this, and this is basically what is indicative of a greater importance of the China trade, is the growth of the clipper ships. And the clipper ships are developed around the 1850s. And for a short 10-year period, roughly 1850 to 1860, these are the biggest, most beautiful ships that have ever been built, lots of mass, and capable of making the same journey that the Empress of China took in half the time, ensuring products such as tea do not suffer from spoilage, and there's greater contact and greater ability to trade with China here. And this kind of takes us up to where we are with U.S. and China up to the beginnings of the Civil War in 1860. So China is getting some benefit, but it's also getting kind of destabilizing influence in the form of both merchant traders who are bringing in opium, again, on the U.S. side, not to the same degree as British, but still it's happening. And we've seen the imperial government kind of lose a lot of credit in the sense that it has been humiliated by the first Opium War. And this is not just something that's limited to abroad. This is also something people internally know. And we've also got Jesus coming to China. And on our next show, we're going to see just how close people felt to Jesus, and in particular, one failure in his civil service examinations, how he felt about Jesus and what that did to China, too.
Well, and we also have the discovery of gold in California to look forward to, which changed some things.
Yes, it did.
Now, did the British continue the opium trade after?
Oh, yeah.
I presume so.
Oh, yeah. Unmolested. I mean, there's a second Opium War that comes across, but again, not much the Chinese can do to counter that.
Not with that projection of power.
No.
And that was 1856 to 1860, I think it was, the Second Opium War. Right.
There's some other stuff going on, which we'll get into in the next time.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, till next time. Why was it called the Middle Kingdom?
Center of the universe.
Okay. I've not heard that term before.
That's how they thought of themselves.
I
Yes.
believe you, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a common trait of like what's been called universal empires, and what that kind of means is obviously they're not universal, but in the context of their world, right? They're the big dominant empire in their
They're
world.
big. They have a very long history.
And there's limited travel anywhere else. So pretty much in East Asia, China was the universal empire, even though there were other countries and tributaries and things around it, right? There's been various ones in the Middle East over the years, right? Or in India. There's been the Roman Empire was a universal empire of its time. Doesn't mean it literally means it controls everything, right?
But as far as anybody's concerned, that's the empire.
But that's the empire, right? So, if you're in East Asia, they're the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much travel anywhere else.